The wind dragged small swirls of dust that danced like wandering spirits under the relentless Arizona sun. Clara Whitmore, with her 23 years marked in every premature fold of her face, observed the arid landscape from the window of the rickety carriage that carried her to Dusty Creek. Her fingers, cracked from work and the dry climate, caressed the frayed edge of her faded blue dress, the only vestige of more prosperous times. The driver announced their arrival with a dry grunt. Clara took her suitcase as light as her hope and descended with what dignity she had left. 2 months earlier, her father's coffin had descended into the earth, taking with it the last vestiges of her previous life. All she had inherited were debts and a name tainted by rumors of shady business in the cattle trade. Her boots raised small clouds of dust as she advanced down the main street. Dusty Creek was barely a handful of buildings defying the desert: a saloon, a general store, the sheriff's office, and some scattered houses that seemed about to surrender to the next storm. The sun fell like molten lead on her shoulders, and Clara felt that each step sank her deeper into a land that promised nothing. "A woman alone doesn't last long in these parts," the lady from the carriage had said, with a mixture of compassion and warning. Clara stopped in front of the general store. The display window showed a mirror with a wooden frame that returned an image she barely recognized. Brown hair carelessly gathered, green eyes that had lost their shine, skin once pale now tanned by weeks under the relentless sun. She was no longer the daughter of the prosperous merchant she once was, but a woman who carried the weight of her solitude as her only true possession. "Looking for something in particular, miss?" asked the shopkeeper from the threshold, drying his hands on a stained apron. "Work," Clara replied with a voice firmer than she felt. "Any honest work." The man examined her with the calculating gaze of someone who has seen many desperate people come and go. They might need help at Broken Spur Ranch. It's about 2 miles west, following the dry creek. Clara nodded, thanking him with a silent gesture. Inside her, a small flame of hope flickered, as fragile as a candle in the desert wind. Broken Spur Ranch emerged from the landscape like a stubborn dream. A main wooden house, surrounded by corrals, a stable, and a reddish barn that seemed to burn under the evening light. Clara stopped on the path to catch her breath. Her feet ached and her dress stuck to her back with sweat. From a distance, she distinguished the figure of a man working on the corral fence. His movements were precise and energetic, hammering with the methodical strength of someone who knows the value of each nail. Clara observed how the sun drew the silhouette of his broad shoulders against the burning horizon. The man looked up when she approached, and Clara felt the weight of his gaze. He would be about 27, she calculated. His face, weathered by the sun and framed by dark hair that fell rebelliously over his forehead, revealed the hardness of someone who had faced too many storms for his age. "I'm looking for the owner of the ranch," said Clara, straightening to hide her fatigue. The man put down the hammer and approached. Up close, Clara could see that his eyes were a deep blue, like water wells in the middle of the desert. "You're talking to him," he responded with a deep voice, wiping his hands on his worn pants. "Ethan Blackwood." "Clara Whitmore," she introduced herself, extending a hand that he briefly shook. "I was told in town that you might need help." Ethan observed her carefully. His gaze was not invasive, but evaluative, like someone measuring the resistance of a material. "What do you know how to do?" "Cook, sew, keep accounts," Clara enumerated. "My father had a cattle business in Colorado. I learned to manage it." A shadow crossed Ethan's face at the mention of cattle. "Why do you come alone to Arizona?" The question floated between them like a storm cloud. Clara held his gaze, deciding how much to reveal. "My father died 2 months ago. He left more debts than money, and a name that doesn't exactly open doors for me." Silence extended while Ethan seemed to deliberate. The wind shook Clara's hair and she moved it away from her face with a gesture she had repeated 100 times during the journey. "Martha, my cook, could use an assistant," Ethan finally said. "I'll give you lodging and $3 a week. It's all I can offer." Clara nodded, aware that it was little but more than she had. "There's something else you should know," he added, and his voice acquired a different tone, more urgent. "This ranch is in a difficult situation. I need—" He stopped as if the words were too big to come out. I need you to understand what you're getting into." Clara perceived that there was much more behind that warning, but the sun was setting, and the prospect of a roof and a bed weighed more than any uncertainty. "I'll understand tomorrow," she replied. "Tonight, I just need to rest." For the first time, something like a smile softened Ethan's face. "Come," he said, pointing towards the house. "I'll introduce you to Martha." As she followed him, Clara felt that she was leaving footprints in the dust that she could never erase. She didn't know if she had just found a refuge or walked into another storm. The kitchen smelled of freshly baked bread and dried herbs hanging in bunches from the ceiling. Martha Cole turned out to be a woman of about 60, with grey hair gathered in a severe bun and knotty hands that never stopped moving. Her eyes, however, were young and perceptive, and they examined Clara with the precision of someone who has learned to read people like an open book. "So you need work," she said, more as a statement than a question while serving a plate of stew. "Eat first. Decisions are better made on a full stomach." Clara obeyed, aware of Martha's gaze and how Ethan remained silent, leaning against the doorframe like a vigilant shadow. The stew tasted like home, like something Clara thought forgotten. "Thank you," she murmured when her plate was empty. "It was delicious." "Don't thank me yet," Martha replied with a grimace that might have been a smile. "You haven't seen what you'll have to do tomorrow." Ethan approached then, taking a seat across from Clara. In the light of the oil lamps, his face seemed carved in stone. "There's something I must tell you," he began, and his voice contained a barely controlled tension. "This ranch is in danger." Clara waited, feeling that she was about to discover the true price of her refuge. "There's a piece of land to the north, 160 acres with access to the only creek that doesn't dry up in summer," Ethan continued. "Without that water, the cattle won't survive. The government is granting property titles to those who occupy and improve the land for 5 years. His fingers drummed on the table, the only sign of his restlessness. "But there's a requirement. It must be a family who claims it. A marriage." The silence that followed was so dense that Clara could hear the crackling of the flame in the lamp. She then understood where the conversation was heading. "You're suggesting," she began, and the words dried in her throat. "A marriage," Ethan confirmed, holding her gaze. "On paper, an agreement." Martha snorted from the kitchen but didn't intervene. Clara felt like the ground was opening beneath her feet. The proposal was as unexpected as the storm now beating. "Against the windows come from nowhere. You barely know me," she finally said. "Why would you entrust something so important to a stranger?" "Because I have no alternative," he replied frankly, "and because you don't seem to have one either." The truth of those words hit Clara like a slap. If she rejected the proposal, what was left for her? Continue wandering from town to town until money or luck ran out? "What would I gain?" she asked, and her voice sounded firmer than she expected. "A secure home, a part of what we build. And my word that I will respect your conditions." Clara looked towards the window. The rain drew erratic, paths on the glass, like the decisions that had led her there. "I need to think about it," she finally said. "There's not much time," Ethan replied. "The government inspector will arrive in 3 days. If he doesn't find a family occupying the parcel, we'll lose it." Clara closed her eyes for a moment. She felt the weight of a decision that would change the course of her life. When she opened them, her gaze met Ethan's, and in it she saw something she didn't expect. Not desperation, but a quiet determination, the same that had kept her standing during the last few months. "I have conditions," Clara said slowly. "Separate bedrooms, a fair salary for my actual work on the ranch, and freedom to leave when I decide, with a portion agreed upon beforehand." Ethan nodded, and something like relief briefly softened his features. "We'll draft an agreement early tomorrow," he said, extending his hand across the table. "Do we have a deal, Miss Whitmore?" Clara looked at that hand hardened by work, aware that she was about to chain her fate to that of a stranger, and a land she didn't know. But deep in her soul, a voice whispered that perhaps, just perhaps, she was making the first truly her own decision in a long time. "We have a deal, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, shaking his hand. The storm increased outside as if the sky itself wanted to seal that improbable pact. Dawn came with a brutal clarity, as if the previous night's storm had washed the world until it was raw and new. Clara found herself before the cracked mirror in the small room Martha had assigned her, contemplating her reflection as if she could find in it some sign that she was taking the right path. Her most presentable dress, a simple, grey suit that she had kept for special occasions, seemed to mock the solemnity of the moment. What kind of bride marries for a contract and a piece of land she hasn't even seen? 3 soft knocks on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Mr. Blackwood says they'll be ready to leave in half an hour," Martha announced from the hallway. "The sheriff is waiting for them in town to officiate the ceremony." "Thank you, Martha," Clara replied, and her voice sounded strange to her, as if it belonged to someone else. When she came down the stairs, she found Ethan in the living room. He wore a clean white shirt under a dark vest, and had combed his rebellious hair back. He seemed as uncomfortable with the formality as she was. "Good morning," Clara greeted, and the greeting seemed inadequate for the occasion. Ethan nodded, and his eyes lingered on her for a moment, registering the grey dress and hair gathered with more care than the day before. "I've drafted the agreement," he said, spreading a paper on the table. "Just as we discussed last night." Clara read the document carefully. It was simple and direct. A formal marriage before the law, but private in the personal, a stipulated salary for her work on the ranch, her right to leave when she wished with an agreed compensation, and the promise to share the benefits of the northern land if she remained the 5 years necessary to obtain the definitive title. "It seems correct," she said, taking the pen he offered her. Their signatures remained side by side, 2 promises of ink on paper. The journey to town took place, in a silence loaded with unexpressed thoughts. The carriage advanced along the path bordered by sagebrush and cacti, and Clara observed the landscape, trying to reconcile herself with the idea that this land would be her home. "It's beautiful, in its way," Ethan suddenly said, following her gaze. "When it rains, the desert blooms like you wouldn't imagine." "Were you born here?" Clara asked, grateful for the conversation that broke the tension. "My father brought the family when I was 12. He came with big dreams and a couple of skinny cows." A fleeting smile illuminated his face. "He died 3 years ago, leaving me the ranch and those same dreams." Clara nodded, recognizing in those words an echo of her own story. "Mine also had big dreams," she said softly. "Too big, perhaps." She didn't add more, and Ethan didn't ask. The carriage continued its march, while the sun ascended in a sky so vast that it seemed impossible to encompass. The sheriff's office was an austere building of wood and adobe. Sheriff Wilson turned out to be a middle-aged man with a graying mustache and kind eyes that didn't hide his surprise at the couple standing before him. "Are you sure about this girl?" he asked quietly, when Ethan stepped aside to speak with his witness, a neighboring rancher named Luke Tanner. "I'm sure," Clara replied, and discovered that it was true. The ceremony was brief and devoid of sentimentality. They exchanged simple vows, practical promises of mutual respect and support that made no mention of love. When Ethan slid a simple gold ring on her finger, a ring that, as he briefly explained, had belonged to his mother, Clara felt a lump in her throat that she couldn't interpret. "I pronounce you husband and wife," announced the sheriff, closing his book with a dry thump. "May God bless this union." The midday sun entered through the window, drawing a golden rectangle on the dusty floor. Clara and Ethan remained for a moment in that space of light, as if neither knew what to do next. Finally, Ethan offered her his arm with a formal gesture. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, and the new name sounded strange and solemn. Clara rested her hand on the offered arm, feeling, beneath the fabric, the firmness of muscles worked by years of effort. "Mr. Blackwood," she responded, and for an instant their gazes met in a silent recognition of the extraordinary nature of their situation. They went out to the main street of Dusty Creek as husband and wife, under a sun that sealed promises as fragile as the paper on which they were written. The dawn of the 3rd day found Clara and Ethan riding towards the northern parcel. She rode a gentle mare with a chestnut coat, a wedding gift from Martha, who had declared that no woman of this ranch will go on foot as if she were a laborer. She wore men's pants under her gathered skirt, a practical concession that would have scandalized the ladies of her previous life. The sun had barely begun to warm when they reached the top of a gentle hill. Ethan stopped his horse and pointed. towards the valley that stretched out before them. "That's the land," he said, and his voice contained a quiet pride. 160 acres of promise. Clara contemplated the landscape, an undulating expanse of reddish earth dotted with sagebrush and small twisted trees. In the distance, a silver thread wound through the rocks, the creek that made this parcel a treasure in the middle of the desert. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely. "My father tried to claim it years ago," Ethan continued as they resumed the descent. "He built a cabin near the creek and began to cultivate the land, but a storm destroyed the cabin and he fell ill that winter. He could never try again." Clara perceived the sadness in his voice, the weight of an inherited dream. "We'll succeed this time," she said, and was surprised by her own determination. Ethan glanced at her, as if also surprised by that implicit "we" in her words. They rode, in silence, until they reached the remains of what had been the cabin. Only the stone foundations and some blackened beams remained. Nearby, a solitary old apple tree extended its branches like supplicating arms towards the sky. "My mother planted it," explained Ethan, dismounting beside the tree. "She said every home needs something that bears fruit." Clara dismounted as well, approaching the tree. Among the branches bare from winter, she thought she saw small green buds announcing spring. "It's still alive," she murmured, touching one of the buds with her fingertips. "Like everything that clings to this land," Ethan replied. They spent the day working in synchronized silence. Ethan measured and marked the perimeter of the new cabin, while Clara cleared the ground of stones and weeds. The government inspector would arrive the next day, and they needed to show clear signs of occupation and improvement. When the sun began to descend, they sat in the shade of the apple tree to share the lunch Martha had prepared. The bread, cheese, and dried apples tasted better under that open sky. "What was your life like before?" Ethan suddenly asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had established between them. Clara slowly chewed a piece of apple, considering her response. "Different," she finally said. "My father had a prosperous business. We lived in a nice house in Colorado Springs. I wore elegant dresses and attended dances where young men of good family courted me." The irony in her voice was subtle but perceptible. "And, do you miss that life?" Ethan's question seemed casual, but Clara perceived a genuine interest. "I miss the security," she responded honestly. "The feeling that tomorrow was guaranteed. But now I know it was an illusion. My father bet every dollar. He earned, and when he lost, he borrowed. In the end, the nice house and elegant dresses were built on debts and lies." Ethan nodded, understanding. "My father was also a dreamer," he said. "But his dreams were honest. He just wanted to build something that would last, something he could leave to his children. And he succeeded," Clara pointed out, looking around. "He left you this land and the determination to defend it." A fleeting smile crossed Ethan's face, softening his features. "I suppose so," he conceded. "And now there are two of us to defend it." The "there are two of us" floated between them like a different promise than the one they had signed. Clara felt an inexplicable warmth in her chest, as if something dormant was beginning to awaken. That night they camped near the foundations of the future cabin. Under the desert stars, brighter and closer than Clara had ever seen, they talked about plans for the land, where they would build corrals, what they would cultivate near the creek, how they would reinforce the cabin to withstand winter storms, and as the moon ascended in the infinite sky, Clara felt that perhaps, just perhaps, this marriage of convenience could become something truer than many unions based on promises of eternal love. The government inspector turned out to be a meticulous man with inquisitive eyes who examined every detail as if looking for deception. In every shadow, he introduced himself as Samuel Reed, and the sun made the badge on his jacket shine as he walked around the parcel with measured steps. "So you've been here for 3 days, he commented, noting something in his notebook. "It's a modest beginning." Clara, who had taken pains to prepare coffee on the small fire they had built, offered him a steaming cup. "We've been busy clearing the land and planning," she replied with a polite smile. "My husband wants to ensure the cabin is sturdy before the spring rains." The word husband still sounded strange on her lips, like a borrowed garment that didn't quite fit. Reed accepted the coffee and looked at Ethan, who was placing the first beams of the structure. "The regulation is clear, Mrs. Blackwood. The parcel must be continuously inhabited." If you're absent for more than 6 months, you'll lose the right to claim it. We know, Clara replied firmly. We intend to establish ourselves here permanently. Reed observed her with that penetrating gaze that seemed to want to discover lies under her skin. I've seen many couples come with big dreams and leave with the first hard winter, he said, taking a sip of coffee. This land tests even the most solid marriages. Ethan approached then, wiping the sweat from his forehead with his forearm. We're prepared for those tests, Mr. Reed, he said, and his voice had a conviction that made Clara look at him with new admiration. The inspector nodded slowly, as one who reserves judgment. The government will verify your progress in 6 months, he announced, taking a document from his briefcase. Meanwhile, this is your provisional permit. I wish you luck. You'll need it. When Reed left, leaving behind a cloud of dust and skepticism, Clara and Ethan exchanged a look of silent triumph. The first battle was won, but the war had barely begun. The following days established a routine that soon became a natural rhythm. Every morning they rode from the main ranch to the northern parcel, worked during the day on the construction of the cabin, and returned at sunset, tired but with the satisfaction of visible progress. One afternoon, while Ethan was raising the frame of a window, Clara sat under the apple tree with the box of nails. The March sun was more temperate, and small wildflowers were beginning to appear among the stones, like white and yellow stars in a reddish sea. My mother loved wildflowers, commented Ethan, approaching to drink water. She said they were braver than garden flowers, because they grew without anyone taking care of them. Clara smiled, picking a small white flower. My mother died when I was 8, she said quietly. I barely remember her except for the smell of lavender on her clothes and how she sang while cooking. Ethan sat beside her, closer than usual. His presence was solid and reassuring. Mine left 5 winters ago, he said. A pneumonia that no doctor could cure. The silence that followed was full of shared memories, of losses that somehow united them more than the signatures on a paper. When the cabin is finished, Ethan continued after a moment, I'd like to plant lavender by the door, if that's all right with you. Clara looked at him, surprised by that unexpected gesture. It wasn't a grand declaration, but something much more valuable. A small bridge extended between their separate worlds. I would like that very much, she replied softly. Ethan nodded, as if they had just sealed a pact more important than their marriage contract, and returned to work. Clara observed him as he hammered with rhythmic precision and found herself admiring the way the muscles in his arms tensed beneath his shirt, the concentration on his face, the unexpected gentleness he hid beneath his reserved exterior. That night, as they returned to the main ranch under a sky beginning to be stained with stars, Clara felt that something had changed between them. It wasn't the words said, but the shared silences, the fleeting glances, the small gestures like offering her water or adjusting her stirrup without her asking. They were putting down roots, she realized, not just in that reddish earth, but in each other, slowly and imperceptibly, like the invisible roots of the apple tree that extended beneath the dry land in search of water. Harlan Bates entered the general store like a storm on a clear day, unexpected and disturbing. Clara, who was buying provisions for the week, noticed him immediately. It wasn't just his impeccable suit, out of place in that dusty town, but the way the space seemed to contract around him, as if the air itself recognized his presence. Mrs. Blackwood, he greeted her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. What a surprise to find you here. I had heard rumors about Ethan's hasty marriage, but I didn't believe them until now. Clara held his gaze, feeling an immediate antipathy towards that man with overly polished manners. Mr. Bates, she replied with an educated coldness, I see news travels fast even in the desert. Everything travels fast when it's interesting enough, he replied, approaching until he was a step away. And a marriage as convenient as yours certainly arouses curiosity. The insinuation was as clear as the creek water, and Clara felt her face heating up. 3 weeks in Dusty Creek had been enough to hear about Harlan Bates, the son of the man who had always coveted the Blackwoods lands, now turned into a prosperous landowner with political connections and ambitions that didn't stop at scruples. My marriage is none of your business, Mr. Bates, she replied, turning towards the counter to pay for her purchases. Everything related to that northern land is my business, ma'am, Bates's voice had lost its courteous tone. "My father tried to claim it legitimately for years. The Blackwoods have always taken advantage of legal technicalities to keep what doesn't belong to them." Clara turned, confronting him with a calmness she didn't feel. "I understand your father lost all his appeals in the courts, Mr. Bates. The law has spoken clearly about to whom that land belongs." Harlan leaned slightly, and his voice became a threatening whisper. "Laws change, Mrs. Blackwood, and marriages of convenience tend to be more fragile than they seem." Before Clara could respond, the store door opened, and Luke Tanner, the foreman of Broken Spur Ranch, entered. His tall, lanky figure seemed to fill the space, and his gaze hardened upon seeing Bates. "Mrs. Blackwood is ready to return, Mr. Bates," he said, with forced courtesy. "Her husband is waiting for her." Harlan stepped back with a smile that seemed like a crack in a perfect mask. "Of course," he said. "It's been a pleasure, Mrs. Blackwood. Give my regards to your fortunate husband." Clara gathered her purchases with hands she couldn't keep completely steady. As Luke helped her load the provisions into the cart, she felt Bates's gaze like a cold shadow on her back. "That man is a snake in a suit," muttered Luke when they were at some distance, "always looking for ways to harm the boss." "What exactly does he want from that land?" asked Clara. "There must be other parcels with water in the region." Luke shook his head as he drove the cart along the dusty road. "It's not just the water, Mum, it's revenge. Old Bates lost everything he had trying to get those lands. He died bitter and in poverty. The son has sworn to complete what his father started, and he has the money and influence to try." Clara looked towards the horizon, where the distant mountains were drawn like shadows against the sky. Bates's threat floated in her mind like a dark cloud. That night, while they had dinner in the ranch kitchen, Clara told Ethan about the encounter. She observed how his face tensed and his hands closed into involuntary fists. "I should have warned you about him," said Ethan with his gaze fixed on his plate. "Bates has been trying to undermine my position since I inherited the ranch. He offered to buy the property for less than half its value, and when I refused, he began to spread rumors about the bad financial situation to scare away potential investors." "Is it true?" asked Clara softly. "About the financial situation?" Ethan looked up, and in his eyes Clara saw a vulnerability that he rarely showed. "The ranch is going through hard times," he admitted. "Last year's drought affected the cattle, and I had to sell at low prices. Without the northern land and its water, we won't survive another similar drought." Clara extended her hand across the table, covering Ethan's in an instinctive gesture. "We won't allow it," she said, with a firmness that surprised them both. Ethan's fingers intertwined with hers, warm and rough from work. It was the first time they had touched like this, without the practical purpose of daily work, and Clara felt a shiver run down her back. "Bates will try anything to discredit our marriage before the inspector," warned Ethan. "If he discovers it's an arrangement, then we'll have to convince him otherwise," completed Clara. "We'll have to be a marriage in the eyes of everyone." The words hung between them, charged with a meaning that went beyond the simple agreement they had signed. In Ethan's eyes, Clara thought she saw a glimpse of something new, a spark that could ignite a fire warmer than that of simple convenience. Martha, who had been listening in silence from her place by the stove, let out a snort that could have been exasperation or approval. "It was about time you realized," she muttered, turning towards her pots. "True love always begins with two people joining forces against something greater than themselves." Clara felt her cheeks flew, but she didn't withdraw her hand. Under the table, Ethan's foot rested lightly against hers, a contact so subtle that it could have been accidental, but she knew it wasn't. Outside, the desert wind blew strongly, carrying away the last lights of the day. But in that kitchen, among the dancing shadows projected by the oil lamp, something new and fragile began to bloom, like the first wildflowers after the rain. April arrived with capricious winds and skies that couldn't decide between. Clear blue and threatening clouds. The cabin on the northern land had taken shape. Firm walls, a roof that didn't let the rain through, windows that looked towards the creek like vigilant eyes. Clara had insisted on planting a small garden next to the door, where the promised lavender was beginning to appear timidly among the reddish earth. They rode there almost daily, working side by side on the 1,000 details that transformed a structure into a home. A home that officially they should occupy in less than 2 weeks to meet the inspector's requirements. "You should look at the account books," said Ethan one afternoon, while nailing boards to build a table. "You were good with numbers, according to what you said." Clara, who was hanging curtains on the windows, curtains she had made with fabrics bought in town, with a design of small blue flowers that reminded her of her childhood, turned surprised. "Would you trust me with that?" Ethan looked at her with an expression that Clara still couldn't fully decipher, a mixture of respect and something deeper that made her heart beat a little faster. "I trust you," he replied simply. "You've proven to be more loyal to the ranch than many who have worked there for years." Clara nodded, moved by those words that, coming from a man as reserved as Ethan, were worth more than any grandiose declaration. That same night, sitting at the desk in the main ranch's study, Clara immersed herself in the account books. The figures told a clear story. Broken Spur Ranch was on the edge of financial precipice. The previous year's drought had decimated the cattle, and the loans to maintain the operation had interest rates that threatened to devour any future profit. Ethan entered silently and sat across from her. In the lamplight, his face seemed more vulnerable, the lines of worry more marked. "Is it that bad?" he asked quietly. Clara saw no sense in sugarcoating the truth. "We need to change the way the cattle is managed," she replied. "Sell before the next drought, diversify with resistant crops in the northern land, renegotiate the loans." She stopped upon seeing the shadow that crossed Ethan's face. "My father always said a rancher lives and dies with his cattle," he murmured. "Selling now would be like admitting defeat." Clara closed the account book and, in a gesture that weeks ago would have been unthinkable, covered Ethan's hand with hers. "Sometimes taking a step back is the only way to keep moving forward," she said softly. "It's not about abandoning your father's dream, but adapting it so it survives." Ethan turned his hand so that their palms met, and Clara felt the warmth of his rough skin against hers. "I've never been good at adapting," he confessed with a sad smile. "I'm as stubborn as this land." "And as resilient as it is," added Clara. "That's why you're still here, fighting, when others would have given up." Their gazes met in the golden half-light of the room, and Clara felt something stirring inside her, a silent storm of emotions that had been growing day by day. She could no longer deceive herself. What she felt for Ethan had ceased to be simple, gratitude or respect. It was something deeper, more frightening. "Clara," murmured Ethan, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. The door opened abruptly, and Luke entered with a face tense with concern. "Boss, there's trouble," he announced. "One of Bates's men has been prowling near the northern parcel. Thompson saw him this afternoon with what looked like an official document." The moment of intimacy broke like a mirror, leaving only bright fragments of what could have been. Ethan stood up immediately, Clara's hand still warm in his. "We need to find out what he's plotting," he said, and his voice had regained the hardness of always. "Luke, tomorrow we'll go to town to talk to the sheriff." When Luke withdrew, Ethan turned to Clara, still holding her hand. "We should rest," he said, although his eyes said other things. "Tomorrow will be a long day." Clara nodded, aware that the moment had passed, but also that something fundamental had changed between them. As she climbed the stairs to her room, she could feel Ethan's gaze following her, as tangible as a caress. That night, lying in her solitary bed, Clara contemplated the ring she wore on her finger, the ring of Ethan's mother. What had begun as a symbol of a business agreement now weighed differently, loaded with meanings she dared not fully name. Outside, the desert wind howled among the ranch buildings, like an echo of the storm that stirred in her heart. Clara wondered if Ethan, in his room across the hall, would also be awake, listening to the wind and thinking of her. The answer came in the form of soft steps in the corridor, a brief pause in front of her door, and then the sound of someone slowly walking away, taking with them words not said and feelings not yet confessed. Sheriff Wilson's office smelled of old leather, rancid coffee, and the unmistakable aroma of official papers. Clara stood beside Ethan while the sheriff examined the document they had obtained after speaking with the court clerk. It's a formal request to review the validity of your claim on the northern land, confirmed Wilson, removing his glasses with a tired gesture. Bates alleges that your marriage is fraudulent, that it's just an arrangement to meet the legal requirements. Clara felt the ground moving beneath her feet, her worst fears confirmed in black and white. What evidence does he have? Asked Ethan, and his voice sounded dangerously controlled. Testimonies that you barely knew each other before getting married, replied Wilson. Rumors that you maintain separate rooms, that you're never seen behaving like a real marriage. Rumors are not evidence, intervened Clara, straightening as she had done so many times before her father's creditors. And the speed of our marriage doesn't make it less legitimate. The sheriff looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. Under normal circumstances, I would agree, Mrs. Blackwood, but Bates has connections in the territorial government. He has requested a special investigation, and I'm afraid Inspector Reed will return sooner than expected to evaluate the situation. Ethan stepped forward, placing his hands on the desk. When? Next week, replied Wilson. And this time he won't. Come just to check the cabin. He'll come to determine if you are a real marriage or a farce. The silence that followed was so dense that Clara could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall like hammer blows. Thank you for the warning, Sheriff, Ethan finally said. We'll be prepared. Outside, under the relentless midday sun, Clara felt her courage beginning to crumble. They had worked so hard, had come so far, only to lose it all because of a bitter man's revenge. What are we going to do? She asked, as they walked towards the horses tied in front of the office. Ethan stopped and turned to her. In his eyes, Clara saw a determination that ignited a spark of hope. We're going to defend what's ours, he replied firmly. Starting right now. He took her hand naturally, intertwining his fingers with hers, and continued walking. Clara followed him, confused, but strangely comforted by that contact. Bates has spies everywhere, explained Ethan in a low voice. If he wants to see a marriage, we'll give him one to see. They passed in front of the general store, where several townspeople observed them with barely disguised curiosity. Ethan greeted them with a gesture, keeping Clara close, his arm now around her waist with a familiarity that made her cheeks flush. You're blushing, murmured Ethan with a barely perceptible smile. Perfect. Clara didn't know whether to feel indignant or amused. She opted to play along, leaning slightly towards him as they walked. Is this part of the plan? She asked quietly. Every detail counts, he replied, helping her mount her mare with attentions he had never before shown in public. From now until the inspection passes, we have to be the most authentic marriage this town has ever seen. Clara nodded, understanding the strategy, but feeling strangely disturbed by it. How to pretend something she was already beginning to feel for real. How to distinguish between the act for observers and the real feelings growing in her heart. That night, during dinner at the ranch, Ethan announced to Martha and the workers that he and Clara would move to the northern cabin the next day to establish their permanent residence there, as planned. But we'll need help finishing the last details, he added. Luke, can you organize a couple of men to help us move the furniture? The foreman nodded, exchanging a knowing look with Martha. It was about time you had your own space, commented the cook with an astute smile. Young marriages need privacy. Clara felt the heat rising from her neck to her cheeks. Ethan seated beside her casually. He placed his hand over hers in a gesture that was beginning to become familiar. You're right, Martha, he said with a naturalness that surprised Clara. It's time we began our life together, as it should be. Later, while preparing her few belongings. For the move, Clara heard a soft knock on her bedroom door. It was Ethan, with an uncomfortable expression she hadn't seen on him in weeks. I wanted to talk to you, he said, remaining on the threshold. About what I said at dinner. Clara put down the dress she was folding and approached him. I understand the strategy, she replied. We have to be convincing. Ethan shook his head. It's not just about strategy, Clara. The cabin. He stopped, searching for words. It only has one room. The implication floated between them like a cloud charged with electricity. Oh, was all Clara managed to articulate. I can build a screen to give you privacy, Ethan continued quickly. And I'll sleep on the floor, of course. But if the inspector arrives without warning... I understand, Clara interrupted him. It's what we must do. They looked at each other in silence, and Clara wondered if Ethan could hear the accelerated beats of her heart. It wasn't just the prospect of sharing such an intimate space that disturbed her, but the strange sensation that this arrangement for appearances was actually a step towards something they both desired but dared not name. "There's something else," said Ethan, and for the first time since she had known him, Clara saw that he hesitated. "Tomorrow Bates will be in town. He'll probably try to provoke us, look for fissures in our story." "And what will we do?" asked Clara. Ethan took a step towards her, shortening the distance between them until she could feel the heat of his body. "We'll have to be convincing," he murmured, and his gaze stopped on Clara's lips. "Very convincing." Clara then understood, with a shiver that ran through her entire body, that the performance they were planning could be the bridge that finally united their separate worlds. Fear and anticipation mixed in her chest like water and earth after the rain. "Then," she replied in a whisper, "we should practice." And before she could regret it, she stood on tiptoe and gently pressed her lips against Ethan's. A brief kiss, barely a brush, but enough to change the course of two lives that had begun to flow in the same direction. The cabin by the creek was no longer just a structure of wood and stone. In the 3 days since they had moved in, Clara had transformed the space with small touches that spoke of permanence: curtains on the windows, an embroidered tablecloth on the rustic table, wildflowers in a tin jar by the fire. The scent of freshly planted lavender mixed with that of new wood and the bread she baked in the small stove. Ethan, returning from checking the property boundaries, paused for a moment at the door, observing Clara as she kneaded bread on the wooden board he had carved especially for her. The evening light entered through the west window, bathing her profile in a golden glow that made the loose strands of her hair shine. "Smells good," he said, leaving his hat on the hook by the door. Clara looked up and smiled. A genuine smile, not the one they practiced for the watchful eyes of the town. "It will be ready for dinner," she replied, shaking the flour from her hands. "How's the fence?" Finished, Ethan approached the water barrel to wash. "Tomorrow I'll start on the stable." They had adapted to this new routine with a naturalness that surprised them both. During the day they worked on the parcel. Ethan building structures for the cattle they would soon move, Clara cultivating the garden and organizing the interior of the cabin. At night, they shared dinner by the fire and talked about future plans with a frankness that made the barriers between them fade a little more each day. They slept separated by the wooden screen that Ethan had built, but each night the physical distance seemed more artificial, more imposed than desired. The kiss shared in the ranch bedroom had not been repeated, but it floated between them like a silent promise. "Tomorrow is the inspector's visit," commented Clara, while serving the stew she had prepared. "Luke said they saw him arrive in town this afternoon." Ethan nodded, accepting the plate with a gesture of gratitude. "Reed is a fair man but meticulous," he said. "He'll want to see everything, talk to us separately probably. Bates has surely already planted doubts in his mind." Clara sat across from him, the table so small that their knees almost touched. "You think we'll convince him?" "We won't have to pretend too much," replied Ethan, and his eyes found hers with an intensity that made Clara hold her breath. "Not any more." The words hung between them, charged with a meaning that neither dared to fully define. Clara lowered her gaze to her plate, aware of the blush rising to her cheeks. "I've been thinking," she said after a moment, "about what you said about diversifying the ranch." Ethan looked at her with interest. Since that night in the study, they had talked a lot about the ranch's finances, and he had begun to value her suggestions. "The land by the creek is perfect for growing cotton," continued Clara. "My father had a partner who cultivated in Texas, and he always said that reddish land like this produced the best fiber. If we dedicate part of the parcel to that crop, we could have a source of income that doesn't depend on cattle." Ethan considered the idea while eating. Weeks ago, such a suggestion would have provoked his immediate rejection. A rancher growing cotton like any farmer. But now, it could work, he finally said. "We would have to get seeds, learn about cultivation." "Already got ahead," confessed Clara with a shy smile. "I asked Martha to write to her cousin in San Antonio. He can send us seeds and a manual for beginners." Ethan let out a laugh, and the sound of his laughter, so rare and valuable, made Clara's heart skip. "You're incredible," he said, and the admiration in his voice was unmistakable. "You arrived here with a light suitcase and have built more in a month than I did in 3 years of trying alone." "You're not alone now," Clara replied softly. Dinner continued in a comfortable silence, interrupted only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional hooting of an owl in the old apple tree. When they finished, Clara collected the plates and Ethan went out to secure the horses for the night. Upon returning, he found her standing by the window, contemplating the moon rising over the distant hills. Without thinking, he approached and stopped behind her, so close that he could perceive the lavender scent of her hair. "It's beautiful here," murmured Clara. "I never thought such an arid place could seem so alive." "It is," replied Ethan. "Since you arrived." Clara turned slowly until she faced him, their faces illuminated only by the silver light of the moon and the orange glow of the fire. In her eyes, Ethan saw a reflection of his own longing, of the feelings that had grown between them as naturally. "As the wildflowers after the rain, Ethan," she whispered, and his name on Clara's lips sounded like a question and an answer at the same time. He didn't know who took the first step, only that suddenly his arms were around Clara's waist and hers were linked around his neck. The kiss was different from the first, not a tentative brush but a long-awaited encounter. Ethan's hands tangled in Clara's hair, freeing it from the pins that held it, while she clung to him as if afraid he might vanish. When they finally separated, breathless, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "This isn't for the inspector," he murmured. "Not for Bates, not for the land." "I know," replied Clara, caressing his cheek rough with incipient beard. "It's for us." That night, the wooden screen remained in place, but the emotional distance they had maintained for weeks had crumbled like a wall of sand under the rain. What had begun as an agreement of convenience had transformed into something as real and vital as the creek that nourished that thirsty land. And as Inspector Reed rode towards the property the next morning, what he would find would not be a carefully constructed farce, but the simplest and most powerful truth. Two people who had found in each other exactly what they didn't know they were looking for. Samuel Reed did not come alone. Beside him rode Harlan Bates, his impeccable suit incongruous with the dust of the road, his smile sharp as the blade of a new knife. Clara saw them approach from the window and felt her stomach tense like a piano string. "They're here," she announced, to Ethan, who was stoking the fire. "And Bates is coming with him." Ethan stood up, wiping his hands on his pants with a gesture that Clara had learned to recognize as a sign of his contained nervousness. "Remember," he said, approaching her, "we have nothing to hide." Clara nodded, grateful for the certainty in his voice. The previous night had changed something fundamental between them, had converted the act into reality. She no longer feared not being convincing. She feared that Bates would find some legal technicality, some loophole to take away what was now truly theirs. They went out together to receive the visitors. The morning sun was still gentle, and the breeze gently stirred the wildflowers growing along the path. "Inspector Reed," greeted Ethan, extending his hand. "Welcome back." Reed dismounted with an agile movement for his age and shook the offered hand. "Mr. Blackwood," he responded, and then turned to Clara with a courteous gesture. "Mrs. Blackwood, I apologize for this unexpected visit, but concerns have arisen about your claim." "Unfounded concerns, I'm sure," replied Clara with a serene smile, while Bates dismounted in turn. "That's what we'll determine today," intervened Bates, his honeyed voice rapping sharp words. "The government cannot allow abuse of the land adjudication system." "Of course not," agreed Ethan, maintaining forced courtesy. "Why don't you come in? Clara has just baked fresh bread." The cabin had never seemed so small as when the four sat around the table. Clara served coffee and slices of bread with butter, aware of Bates's scrutinizing gaze, which examined every corner as if looking for evidence of falsehood. "You've done good work here," commented Reed, observing the visible improvements since his last visit. "The cabin is practically finished." "We've worked hard," replied Clara. "It's important for us to create a true home." Bates let out a brief, dry laugh. "A home built with remarkable speed," he said. "Almost as fast as your marriage, Mrs. Blackwood. Or should I call you Miss Whitmore?" I've heard your father had business in Colorado. Business that ended problematically. Clara felt Ethan tensing beside her, but she maintained her composure. My name is Blackwood now, she responded calmly. And yes, my father had difficulties before passing away. It's part of what brought me to Arizona looking for a new beginning. A very convenient beginning, insisted Bates. Arriving with nothing and getting a husband with lands in less than a week. Enough, Bates, intervened Reed firmly. We're here to verify facts, not to launch accusations. The inspector took a notebook from his jacket and began what turned out to be a meticulous interrogation. He asked about their daily life, their plans for the land, how they had met, why they had decided to marry so quickly. Clara and Ethan responded with careful sincerity, interweaving truths and omissions that no longer seemed like lies. I'd like to speak with each of you separately, Reed finally announced. It's standard procedure. Clara went out with the inspector, leaving Ethan and Bates in a tense silence inside the cabin. They walked to the newly planted garden, where the lavender was beginning to show its first purple buds. Lavender, commented Reed, observing the plants. It's not common in these lands. My mother cultivated it, replied Clara. The scent reminds me of her. Reed nodded, and for a moment his expression softened. Mrs. Blackwood, I'll be frank with you, he said. Bates has presented serious allegations. He says he has witnesses who affirm that your marriage was a convenient arrangement, that you barely knew each other before the ceremony, that it's all a scheme to secure this land. Clara held his gaze, aware that what she said next could determine their future. Inspector Reed, she began, may I speak to you with complete honesty? The man nodded, intrigued by her tone. When I arrived in Dusty Creek, I was desperate, confessed Clara. My father had died, leaving me only debts and a tarnished name. I had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. And yes, I barely knew Ethan when I agreed to marry him. Reed watched her attentively, his expression unreadable. But what began as a practical agreement has become something more, she continued, and the emotion in her voice was completely genuine. I've learned to know Ethan, his strength, his dedication to this land, his integrity, and he has come to know me. We work together, plan together, build together. Isn't that a true marriage, regardless of how it began? The wind gently stirred her dress as she waited for Reed's response. In the distance, she could see the creek shining under the sun like a silver vein in the reddish earth. The government is not interested in feelings, Mrs. Blackwood, Reed finally said, but in determining if you are fulfilling the letter and spirit of the settlement law. And we are, Clara replied firmly. We live here. We are improving the land. We are building a future. Together. Reed looked at her for a long time as if trying to read beyond her words. Then, without commenting further, he led her back to the cabin. Inside, the tension was palpable. Ethan was standing by the window, his rigid posture revealing the effort it cost him to contain himself. Bates, seated at the table, had an expression of superiority that made Clara want to slap him. Your turn, Blackwood, said Reed, pointing towards the door. When Ethan passed by Clara, their fingers briefly brushed in a gesture of silent support. She remained alone with Bates, whose smile widened like that of a predator when its prey is cornered. You're a remarkable actress, Mrs. Blackwood, he said in a low voice, for you would almost convince me if I didn't know the truth. Clara sat across from him, keeping her back straight and her chin high. The truth is that you are obsessed with a revenge that will not bring you peace, Mr. Bates, she replied calmly. Your father lost these lands legally and you will lose them again. Bates's smile froze. My father was deceived by yours, he hissed, and now history repeats itself, a Whitmore and a Blackwood conspiring to steal what rightfully belongs to me. Clara looked at him with genuine perplexity. Your father and Blackwoods were partners, spat Bates. Didn't your husband tell you? They traded cattle together before your father betrayed him and ran off with the money. Old Blackwood died ruined and heartbroken by that betrayal. The revelation hit Clara like a physical punch. Was it possible? Did Ethan know? Is that why he had so easily agreed to marry her out of some twisted sense of poetic justice? Before she could fully process the information, the door opened and Ethan and Reed returned. Ethan must have seen something in her face because his expression turned worried. Clara? She had no time to respond. Reed cleared his throat and all eyes turned to him. "I've made my decision," he announced. "Based on my observations and the evident improvements on the property, I consider that the Blackwoods are meeting the requirements for the claim. The request for review is dismissed." Bates rose abruptly, his chair scraping the wooden floor. "This is not over," he warned, and his voice had lost all pretense of courtesy. "I will file a formal appeal with the territorial governor." "That is—" "You're right," replied Reed coldly. "But you will need more solid evidence than rumors and conjectures." When the visitors finally left, leaving behind a trail of dust and promises of future battles, Clara and Ethan were left alone in the cabin they had built together. The silence between them was no longer comfortable, but charged with unasked questions. "What did he tell you?" Ethan finally asked, approaching her. Clara looked up, searching in his blue eyes for the answer to the question that burned inside her. "Did you know?" she asked quietly. "Did you know who my father was?" The sunset stained the cabin walls with golden and coppery tones, creating a deceptive beauty that contrasted with the tension floating between them. Ethan remained motionless, as if Clara's words had turned him to stone. "What are you talking about?" he finally asked, but the slight tremor in his voice betrayed that he perfectly understood the question. "Bates says our fathers were partners," Clara replied, keeping her voice firm despite the knot in her throat. "That my father betrayed yours and left him ruined." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to contain something that threatened to overflow. When he opened them, Clara saw in them a mixture of resignation and sadness. "I knew it the day you introduced yourself," he admitted quietly. "Your surname, Whitmore. It's not common." Clara felt the ground moving beneath her feet. All the shared weeks, the moments of closeness, the confessions by the fire, had they been part of some elaborate revenge plan? "Is that why you offered me the marriage?" she asked, and her voice sounded strange even to her own ears. "Some kind of twisted justice? The daughter of Whitmore saving the lands that her father helped put in danger?" Ethan took a step towards her, but Clara instinctively stepped back. "No," he replied vehemently. "It wasn't like that. At first, when I knew who you were, I was tempted to throw you out. But then I saw your eyes, your determination, how you had traveled alone seeking a new beginning." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that Clara had come to associate with his frustration when words didn't come out as he wished. "I offered you the marriage because I needed to secure the land," he continued. "Because I saw in you the same desperation that I felt. Two people with painful pasts who could help each other, nothing more. And you never thought to tell me." Clara's voice trembled now, not from fear but from pain. "All these weeks while I opened my heart to you, you kept this secret?" Ethan approached again, and this time Clara didn't step back. She could see the anguish in his eyes, genuine and deep. "The more I got to know you, the less it mattered who your father had been," he said softly. "And then, when things between Ennis began to change, I was afraid. Afraid that if I told you, you would think exactly what you're thinking now, that it has all been part of some twisted plan." Clara closed her eyes, trying to process everything she was discovering. The pieces. Fit, Ethan's initial distrust, his reluctance to talk about his father, the strange looks from some townspeople when she mentioned her maiden name. "What did my father do exactly?" she asked, opening her eyes to face whatever truth might come. Ethan sighed and sat in one of the rustic chairs, as if the weight of the story was too much to stand. "They were partners in the cattle business," he began. "Your father provided the contacts and trade routes. Mine provided the cattle raised here. For 3 years the partnership worked well. The ranch prospered. But then your father began to have gambling problems. He started diverting money from the partnership to cover his debts." Clara nodded slowly. That part of the story coincided with what she knew. "My father discovered what was happening," continued Ethan. "There was a confrontation. Your father promised to straighten things out, to return the money. My father believed him. A month later he disappeared with all the money from the season's sale. Almost $5,000, a fortune in those times. And your father was ruined," completed Clara quietly. "He had to mortgage the ranch to survive," confirmed Ethan. "He worked until he fell ill trying to maintain the property. He died believing he had failed, that he would lose the lands for which he had sacrificed. Everything." The silence that followed was charged with echoes of the past, of decisions made by others that now reverberated in their lives. Clara approached the window, observing how the last lights of the day caressed the distant hills. "I'm sorry," she finally said, and the words seemed inadequate but were all she had to offer. "I'm sorry for what my father did to yours." She felt Ethan stand and approach, stopping just behind her, so close that she could feel the heat of his body, but without touching her. "You are not responsible for his actions," he said softly. "Just as I am not responsible for the ghosts my father couldn't let go." Clara turned slowly to look at him, finding in his eyes not the reproach she feared, but an understanding that made her heart contract painfully. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked again, needing to understand. "After all we've shared." "Because I was afraid of losing you," replied Ethan with an honesty that disarmed Clara's last defenses. "Because what began as a practical agreement became the most valuable thing I've ever had. And I was a coward." Clara took a step towards him, reducing the space that separated them. "I had secrets too," she confessed. "I didn't tell you the whole truth about my father, about the debts he left, about how I fled instead of facing his creditors." "We all have parts of our story that hurt too much to share," replied Ethan, and with caution, as if fearing she might vanish, he raised a hand to caress her cheek. "But now, there are no more secrets between us." Clara closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. The revelations hurt like cleaning an old wound, but also brought with them the possibility of true healing. "Our fathers wove this story of betrayal and loss," she murmured, "but we can write a different ending." Ethan drew her to him, enveloping her in an embrace that spoke of protection and belonging. "We're already doing it," he replied against her hair. "Every day we work together on this land. Every night we share our thoughts by the fire." Clara pulled back enough to look into his eyes, to seek in them confirmation of what her heart already knew. "I love you, Ethan Blackwood," she said, the words simple but charged with all they had lived through together. "Not for a contract, or for this land, but for the man you are." The smile that illuminated Ethan's face was like the dawn after the darkest night. "And I love you, Clara," he replied, his voice husky with emotion. "For your courage, your intelligence, your ability to build a home from nothing. I would love you even if we didn't have an acre of land or a roof over our heads." Their lips met in a kiss that tasted of promise and redemption, of a future they would build together, not on the mistakes of the past, but on the truth they had discovered in each other. Outside, the sun finally sank behind the mountains, and the first stars began to shine in the desert sky. A new day awaited, with its own challenges and joys. But for now, in the small cabin by the creek, two people who had arrived there by such different paths had finally found the same destination. May arrived with an explosion of life that seemed a miracle in the arid land. The creek flowed with renewed strength after the spring rains. The hills had covered themselves with an ephemeral but intense green, and the old apple tree had blossomed as if it wanted to compensate for years of solitude with a white exuberance that perfumed the air around the cabin. Clara paused under its branches. The basket of freshly washed clothes rested on her hip to contemplate the spectacle. In the 6 weeks since the inspector's visit, the northern parcel had been transformed. The stable was finished, the corrals ready to receive the cattle that Ethan would soon bring, and the garden next to the cabin was already producing the first tender vegetables. But the deepest transformation had occurred inside the cabin, where the wooden screen remained in a corner, unnecessary since the night they had shared their truths and decided to face the future together without reservations or secrets. "So look like a painting," said Ethan, approaching from the stable where he had been working all morning. "A painting titled Spring in Arizona." Clara smiled, letting him take the heavy basket from her hands. "And you look like a rancher who urgently needs a bath," she joked, wrinkling her nose at the smell of horse and sweat that accompanied him. Ethan laughed, a sound that had become more frequent with the passing weeks. "I'll have it ready in half." "An hour," he promised. "Martha and Luke will arrive for dinner, remember?" Clara nodded. They had invited the cook and the foreman to celebrate the final approval of their claim. The previous day, the official letter had arrived. The northern parcel was legally theirs, provided they continued the improvements and occupation for the next 4 years. While hanging the clothes on the line that Ethan had strung between 2 posts, Clara observed the horizon towards town. They had had no news of Bates since the inspector's visit, which was both a relief and cause for concern. He was not a man who gave up easily. "News from town," announced Ethan, returning from the well with a bucket of fresh water. "I ran into Thompson when I went for the new horseshoes. He says Bates is selling his properties." Clara turned, surprised. "Is he leaving?" Ethan nodded, placing the bucket by the door. "Apparently, his investments in the silver mine to the north have failed. He's liquidating everything to pay his creditors and plans to move to California." The news should have gladdened her, but Clara felt a strange sadness. Bates, with all his bitterness and resentment, was in a way a distorted reflection of what they themselves could have been if they had allowed the mistakes of the past to define their future. "It's strange," she commented, "spending life pursuing a revenge and in the end losing everything due to greed." Ethan approached and surrounded her with his arms, resting his chin on Clara's crown. "Some cling so tightly to the past that they cannot see the present," he murmured. "We were lucky to find another path." Clara leaned against his chest, feeling the constant beating of his heart. It wasn't luck, she thought. It was choice. The choice to forgive, to build, to love, despite the pain. The afternoon passed in preparations for dinner. Clara baked an apple pie with the last preserves of winter, while Ethan prepared the table on the small porch they had added to the cabin. The air was soft and fragrant, perfect for an outdoor dinner. Martha and Luke arrived when the sun began its descent, bringing with them a bottle of wine and fresh news from the main ranch. "The calves are growing strong," informed Luke while helping Ethan light the fire outside. "And the buyers from Denver have confirmed they'll come for the July sale." Martha, for her part, inspected the cabin with a critical but approving eye. "You've made a real home here," she commented to Clara while arranging the cutlery on the table. "When I saw you arrive with that light suitcase, I thought you wouldn't last a week." Clara smiled, remembering the desperate woman she had been then with more pride than hope. "I thought so too," she confessed, "but it turned out I brought with me more than I believed." The dinner was a simple celebration but full of camaraderie. The venison stew that Clara had prepared, the freshly baked bread, the wine shared under the emerging stars. Everything had the flavor of a life that had found its natural rhythm. "I have something for you," said Martha when they finished the apple pie. It arrived this morning with the mail. From her bag, she extracted a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Clara opened it with curiosity, discovering inside a leather-bound book. "Practical Manual of Sea, Otten Cultivation," she read aloud. "Martha, how did you get it?" "My cousin in San Antonio knows people," replied the cook with a wink. "He says it comes with seeds selected for dry climate in that envelope." Ethan examined the small envelope, attached to the book, where tiny seeds waited to transform part of their land. "This could change everything," he murmured, and the gratitude in his voice was palpable. "Diversifying the ranch will protect us in years of drought." "It was Clara's idea," pointed out Martha with maternal pride. "I always said this girl has more between her ears than most men I know." Luke raised his glass of wine in an improvised toast. "To the future of Broken Spur Ranch," he said. "And to the Blackwoods, who knew how to turn an agreement into a real marriage." Clara and Ethan exchanged a knowing look. No one except them knew the whole truth about how they had begun, nor about the ghosts they had had to exorcise to reach where they were now. When Martha and Luke left, the moon was already high in the sky, bathing the landscape in a silver light that softened the contours of the desert. Clara and Ethan remained seated on the porch, enjoying the silence and the cool breeze that brought with it the scent of the apple tree's flowers. "4 more years," commented Ethan, taking her hand on the table. "And this land will be completely ours." Clara intertwined her fingers with his, feeling the roughness of the calluses, the small scars from daily work that now also marked her own hands. "It already is," she replied softly. "From the moment we decided it would be our home." Ethan looked at her with that intensity that still made her heart race. "Do you know what day it is today?" he asked. Clara made a quick calculation. "Thursday?" Ethan smiled, shaking his head. It's exactly 2 months since you arrived in Dusty Creek with your light suitcase and your eyes full of determination. Clara blinked, surprised that he had kept count with such precision. You've remembered all this time? I remember every day since you arrived, he replied simply, but especially the first, because it was when my life changed without me knowing. Ain't yet. From his pocket he extracted something small that shone under the moonlight, a silver ring with a small blue stone embedded. I found the stone in the creek weeks ago, he explained. Luke helped me polish it and set it. It's not a diamond, but it's perfect, interrupted Clara, with moist eyes. Exactly as it should be. Ethan slid the ring on her finger, next to the simple gold hoop that had been his mother's. Our first marriage was out of necessity, he said, his voice husky with emotion. This ring is for love, by choice, for all we have built together and what still awaits us. Clara didn't need words to respond. She leaned towards him, and their lips met in a kiss that tasted of fulfilled promise, of shared future, of fertile land after the drought. And as the moon silently watched over the desert, two people who had arrived there carrying invisible scars discovered that, like the old apple tree, they too could blossom after the hardest winter. 3 years later, the cotton shone like snow under the September sun, extended in ordered rows that descended gently towards the creek. Clara advanced among the plants, her fingers brushing the fluffy balls that seemed like clouds trapped between green leaves. The straw hat protected her from the sun, but small drops of sweat beaded her forehead as she examined the harvest that promised to be the best since they had begun cultivation. "Mom, look what I found!" The enthusiastic little voice made her turn. Samuel, with his 2 years just turned and his legs still unstable on the uneven terrain, held something in his chubby little hand. His dark curls, inherited from Ethan, stirred. With the breeze and his green eyes identical to Clara's, shone with discovery. "What have you got there, darling?" asked Clara, crouching to be at his height. The child opened his hand, revealing a small turquoise-colored stone. "Blue," he declared proudly. "Like your ring." Clara smiled, taking the stone to examine it. "It's beautiful, Sam. We can keep it in your treasure box when we go back home." The boy nodded solemnly before darting off to another point in the field. That had caught his attention. Clara observed him, marveling as she did every day at how that small life had transformed hers in ways she could never have imagined. Samuel had arrived in the midst of the first cotton harvest, as if he too had been waiting for the right moment to bloom in their lives. Ethan had ridden like a madman to town to bring the midwife, and had been so nervous that Luke had to push him out of the room while Martha helped Clara bring their son into the world. Now, 3 years after her arrival in Dusty Creek, Clara Blackwood barely remembered the frightened and desperate woman she had been. The ranch prospered, the northern land flourished, and her marriage, born of necessity, had become the anchor that held everything else. "Looks like we'll have a good harvest." Ethan's voice pulled her from her thoughts. Clara turned to see him, approaching from the stable. The years had been good to him. The lines of worry that once marked his forehead had been replaced by small wrinkles around his eyes, the fruit of smiling more often. "The best so far," replied Clara. Martha was right. About these seeds, they're perfectly adapted to our climate. Ethan stopped beside her, observing the white field that stretched before them like a miracle in the middle of the desert. "Your idea of diversifying the ranch saved us," he said, with that direct frankness that had always been part of him. "The buyers from Denver will arrive next week. If all goes well, we can settle the last loan before Christmas." Clara rested her head on Ethan's shoulder, enjoying the moment of stillness. In the distance, Samuel ran after a butterfly, his laughter mixing with the whisper of the wind among the cotton plants. "Do you remember when all this was just a crazy dream?" she asked quietly. "A desperate woman, a rancher on the brink of ruin, and a marriage of convenience that no one believed would work." Ethan surrounded her waist with an arm, drawing her to him. "Reed confessed to me last year that he had bet we wouldn't last 6 months," he commented with a smile. "He said he had never been so happy to lose a bet." Clara laughed, remembering the severe inspector who now occasionally visited them, always, bringing some small gift for Samuel. "And Bates, he hasn't returned to Arizona since he left. According to the latest news, he's in San Francisco, trying to make his fortune in another business." I hope he has found some peace, Clara nodded. With time, even the grudge towards the man who had tried to take everything from them had softened. They now understood that Bates, like them, was part of a larger story, woven with the threads of decisions made long before any of them were born. "Dad, look!" Samuel ran towards them, now holding a hawk feather found among the plants. Ethan crouched to receive him, lifting him in his arms with a fluid movement that spoke of the practice of 1,000 similar mornings. "A treasure worthy of an explorer," he declared with seriousness, examining the feather. "We can put it in your hat like the great adventurers." The child's eyes lit up at the idea, and Clara felt that familiar wave of love that overwhelmed her when she saw the two men in her life together, so similar in the way they frowned when concentrating, in how their eyes narrowed slightly when they smiled. "We should go back," said Clara, noticing that the sun was beginning its descent. "Martha will be wondering where we've gone." The old cook, who had permanently moved to the northern cabin after Samuel's birth, had become an essential part of their small family. Her tongue was still as sharp as ever, but her hands were incredibly tender when caring for the child or preparing remedies for occasional colds. As they returned along the path that led to the cabin, now expanded with 2 additional rooms and a porch that surrounded 3 of its sides, Clara contemplated the landscape she had come to love so much. The creek shone under the evening light. The poplars they had planted along its banks whispered secrets to the wind, and in the distance, the mountains stood out against a sky that was beginning to be tinged with orange and purple. It wasn't the scenario she had imagined for her life, but it was infinitely more beautiful than any dream she had had. That night, after putting Samuel to bed and listening to his sleepy prayers, Clara and Ethan sat on the porch as they had done almost every night since the cabin became their home. The sky was clear, a black velvet mantle sprinkled with stars that seemed so close they could almost be touched. "I received a letter from Thompson today," commented Ethan, serving her a cup of the herbal tea that Martha prepared. "The negotiations to buy the western parcel are progressing well. If everything goes as we hope, next year we can expand the cultivation." Clara nodded, receiving the cup with gratitude. Her hands, once soft and delicate, now showed the marks of a worked life. Small calluses, a scar on the thumb from when she learned to use the defoliating knife, short and practical nails. They were hands that told a story of transformation just like Ethan's. "Dio, I think we're doing the right thing," she asked. "Expanding more, taking on new risks?" Ethan looked at her, surprised by the question. "I thought you were enthusiastic about the idea. It was your suggestion after all." "And I am," confirmed Clara. "I just wonder sometimes if we shouldn't simply enjoy what we have, the stability that cost us so much to achieve." Ethan took her hand, caressing with his thumb the silver ring with the blue stone he had given her years ago. "I think we've learned to do both things," he replied reflectively, "to value what we have and to continue building at the same time. It's not out of greed that we want to expand, but to secure Samuel's future, and perhaps—" He stopped, looking at her with a silent question in his eyes. "Perhaps?" Clara encouraged him, though she suspected what he was going to say. "Perhaps for the brothers or sisters he doesn't yet have," completed Ethan, with a mixture of hope and caution. Clara smiled, bringing his hand to her belly in a gesture that conveyed more than any word. "In that case, we should consider not 1 but 2 additional rooms," she murmured. Ethan looked at her with amazement, slowly understanding the meaning of her words. "Are you—" His voice broke with emotion. Clara nodded, her eyes bright with contained tears. "Martha suspected it weeks ago. She has hawk eyes for these things. I wanted to be sure before telling you." In an instant, Ethan was on his knees before her, his hands framing her face as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "Clara Blackwood," he murmured, "every day you surprise me. Every day you make me happier than the day before." They kissed under the canopy of stars, with the softness that comes from knowing every nook of the other's soul, every scar, every dream. When they finally separated, Clara rested her forehead against Ethan's, sharing the air and the moment. "Do you know what day it is today?" he asked, repeating the same question he had asked her years ago, the night he gave her the ring. This time, Clara knew exactly what he was referring to. 3 years since I arrived in Dusty Creek, she replied with a smile. 3 years since I made the best wrong decision of my life. Ethan laughed, a warm sound in the cool night. The best wrong decision, he repeated. I like that way of describing it. They stood up and hand in hand contemplated their land, their home, the life they had built together from desperation and necessity, transforming it into something beautiful and lasting. In the bedroom, Samuel slept peacefully, dreaming of hawk feathers and blue stones. In Clara's womb, a new life began its journey, and in the heart of both, where once there had been fear and distrust, now bloomed a love as resistant as the cotton they had learned to cultivate in that arid land. That had become their home. The moon slowly ascended over the horizon, bathing the landscape in a silver light that softened the contours of the desert. Clara and Ethan remained on the porch, shoulder to shoulder, hand in hand, contemplating the future that stretched before them like a field ready for sowing. They didn't know what each season would bring, what storms or droughts they would face, but they were sure of one thing: they would face it together, with roots firmly planted in the land they had learned to love, and hands intertwined as a silent promise. And as the stars slowly turned in their eternal dance, the story of Clara and Ethan Blackwood intertwined with that of the land, the wind, and the creek, becoming part of a larger tale about transformation, resilience, and the healing power of love, born in the most improbable circumstances.